Hi, this is Mark Lux, OSU Extension Weed Science Specialist, and this is the current video that covers new herbicides and other issues that are important for weed management in Ohio right now. Just a reminder, we're still doing the weed control guide every year, so there should be, about the time you're seeing this, there should be a 2023 version of this. You can get hard copy or PDF. If you buy the hard copy, you get a copy of the PDF also for the same price, and you can go to the OSU Extension e-store and do that, although there are some meetings around the state where our county educators are also including the weed control guide as part of their registration fees. Jumping right in, there's a couple new weed herbicides. It's always difficult to tell whether these herbicides are going to be marketed in Ohio because weed herbicides are really developed for the major wheat growing parts of the country, the Dakotas, and the Pacific Northwest. Husky and Osprey have been a couple herbicides that we've had available in Ohio and have been used here. Osprey primarily for grasses, and Husky as a really broad spectrum broadleaf herbicide that can go fall or spring and has a pretty good range of activity. So Husky FX is a tweak on Husky where they've added fluroxapyr. Fluroxapyr has a pretty narrow spectrum of activity, ragweeds, and a couple other weeds. So I don't know that it does a lot for us. It is a 3 site of action herbicide now, and you can use it in fall or spring in wheat, oats, and barley. Osprey Extra, they added thiocarbazone to this, which basically helps it out on brome grasses, which we don't really deal with a lot. It's a pretty broad spectrum grass herbicide. It's decent on annual bluegrass, and annual ryegrass, and has activity on brome and cheat as well. And you can apply it in fall or spring in wheat and triticale, but fall is more effective always for winter annual grasses like annual bluegrass and annual ryegrass. There's a herbicide, Shield X or topyrolate, that's been around for a few years, and I'm not sure we really covered it, and there's some premixes for it, so I'll cover it here. Topyrolate is a Site 27 herbicide, so it's similar to Laudis, Impact, Armazon, and mesotrione. In this group, mesotrione is the one that doesn't have any grass activity. Other than that, they're all really fairly similar. Topyrolate does have activity in small grasses like Laudis and Impact, and Armazon do, so it covers grasses and broadleaves, and has a pretty good range of corn that you can use it on: field corn, popcorn, sweet corn, up to V6 or 20 inches tall. And typical of those type of herbicides, for best activity on a few weeds like giant and common ragweed, for example, it really needs some atrazine. There's something else with it, and that also helps out on small grasses if the corn's still small enough to use atrazine. Catagon is a premix of topyrolate and nicosulfuron or accent. So the accent basically covers a few other broadleaves and beefs up the grass control, so it's for posting grass and broadleaf control. And it would be likely to control larger grasses than topyrolate alone. So topyrolate's up to about 2-inch grasses typically, and the accent's up to 4 inches or higher. The restriction here is because it's accent, you're up to V5 or 20-inch field corn only. Restraint is a mix of Shield X and acetochlor, so this fits in that category of herbicides that have post-emergence activity and also residual. So you can use this assuming you can figure out some reason to have the topyrolate out there pre-emergence and get the activity of the acetochlor, or you can use it post-emergence. This is a situation where the acetochlor would kick in, residual activity on grass, pigweeds, water hemp, nightshade. So you've applied something at planting and you're coming back, maybe 12-inch corn, something like that, to control the weeds that are there and also get some residual. It fits in that category, although it can only go up to 11 inches tall in field corn, popcorn, and sweet corn. We have really a good complement of very broad spectrum residual herbicides for corn. We have a couple of new ones. Maverick fits in that same category as Resicor XL, so it's a premix of mesotrione or Callisto with clopyralid, which is Stinger, and then in this case it's with pyroxasulfone, so that's a different Site 15 herbicide. Resicor has acetochlor in this mix. It's a very broad spectrum mix. Benefits from atrazine probably in some situations. 3 sites of action. You can use it on field corn, seed corn, yellow popcorn. It can go post-emergence up to V6 or 18-inch corn. Needs some surfactant or crop oil with it. The crop oil can cause some temporary injury. If you're using it that way, you're going to get post-emergence control of only broadleaf weeds because the pyroxasulfone will control emerged weeds. So if you're using it in that situation and you've got grasses, you could add some glyphosate or something else to it to pick up the grasses. Bayer has Trivolt, which can go pre and early posting corn, soxaflutol plus thiocarbazone plus flufenicid. What they've essentially done here is taken Corvus, which is a mix of isoxaflutol and thiocarbazone, and added flufenicet, which helps it out. Flufenicet's a Site 15 herbicide that has activity in grass, pigweed, and water hemp. So what it does is extend and improve the grass control somewhat, and also the same thing for pigweed and water hemp. Because of the isoxaflutol, which is limits how late this can be applied. It can go pre-emergence on field corn, seed corn, and also post-emergence, but just up to the V2 stage. So sort of a delayed pre-emergence, very early post-emergence. So it does have some activity on small emerged weeds. The thiocarbazone has activity on emerged grasses, but really in a burn down situation or a post situation, you probably want something else with it to help control emerged broadleaves if they're more than very, very small. And if it goes post-emergence, can't be applied with crop oil or MSO. So if you look at the whole list here, we have, as I said, a good complement of very broad spectrum herbicides. We've got the Lexar Acuron type materials, and you've got some generics there, Stalwart 3W and Helmet Max, which they're a mix of atrazine, mesotron, and S-metolachlor. And then Acuron adds bicyclopyrone, which we don't really give a lot of credit for anything, has about the same ratings, but those are all very broad spectrum herbicides. Then you get to the Resicor and Maverick, which are a mix of clopyrene plus mesotron plus a group 15 herbicide, which are really also very broad spectrum. I think in some cases there, you could use a little bit of atrazine with those particular herbicides. And then you could say the same thing for Trivolt, which is probably, if anything, a hair weak on some broadleaves, but that can be remedied by adding some atrazine to it. But then again, you pick up some added grass and pigweed and water hemp control from that. So a very good start in corn. There's probably some cornfields in the state, especially in the northern part of the state, without giant ragweed, that, these are plenty of herbicide for the season, and other ones where it's obviously a very good start and would build a case to come back pretty late with your post to pick up some of that late grass and water hemp. We do have late season problems because of our rainfall and various things. In both corn and beans, depending on how fast they canopy and how much rain we have and things like that, we do get into late season problems with grasses and water hemp and pigweed especially, and there's some other weeds that do this as well, that come in after our post-emergence, or we haven't planned on a post-emergence. They come in even if we've used a very broad spectrum pre-herbicide like I just talked about. Why does this happen? Well, the seed for these weeds germinates very close to the soil surface or right on the surface within the surface crop residue. So there's an environment there that they don't need to be covered with soil very much to germinate. Same thing with mare's tail. And if they're covered too deeply, they really don't emerge. As I said, we tend to get a lot of mid-season rain, which stimulates new germination, and then in some of those cases, the corn hasn't canopied yet, so it can't suppress weeds on its own, and it really doesn't do that until it starts to close rows and gets competitive at about 20 inches tall. So our pre-herbicides we apply at planting tend to run out of activity by then, or move below the soil surface and below that residue, so that a lot of these, especially this group 15 herbicides, metolachlor, peroxysulfone, and acetochlor, uptake's occurring into plant shoots. So if they move too deep, you have seed germinating right on the surface. You have this environment where the seed and the plants can escape from the herbicide. And then post herbicides are sometimes applied too early or lack residual. So the example is, a lot of people start applying their post sometimes with side dress when corn's 10 inches tall, and you've got weeds coming up. The corn not competitive until 20 inches tall, and some weeds coming up between 10 and 20 inches tall. So an application at something like 18 inches is more likely to pick some of those up, realizing that you have a lot of acres to cover and you can't just necessarily spray it all at 18 inches. But I'll give you a couple different strategies here. One is if you have the type of problems that are going to justify some type of a post-emergence, or you're coming back post-emergence anyway, you can use one of these really comprehensive pre-herbicides that I talked about at planting. You can add some atrazine to some of those that don't already have it, and that's going to build your best window to come back later with your post. So regardless of what you're coming back with, even if it doesn't really have residual, you can delay that to 15 to 20 inch corn if you want to. You don't probably have to spray that at 10 to 12 inches. You can split some of those too. I mean, you can take some of those like the Lexar and the Maverick, for example, and split that so you've got some at planting and some coming back post. Strategy 2 is to use do what I just talked about, do that split so you've got residual coming at planting, and then you're putting the other half of the herbicide on really whenever you want to after about 10 inch corn. Strategy 2 is to is you can also use a less comprehensive pre-herbicide. So here's where you could just use a bicep harness extra corvus without maybe spending the money for the most comprehensive one, and then decide, okay, I'm going to come back when the corn's maybe 10 to 12 inches tall anytime after that and apply post, but I'm going to use something that has some residual on grasses and pigweed and water hemp. So the key is you've got various things. Atrazine has a role here where it can have some activity if you're less than 12-inch corn, but usually what we're counting on there is metolachlor, acetochlor, peroxysulfone type products, and you've got various premixes that supply that. I'll talk about some of these in a second, but you also have can put those, put those with anything that you're putting out post-emergence typically to get that residual. So in that case, you're creating more flexibility. You're basically deciding, okay, I have a lot of acres to cover. I'm going to start spray at about 10 to 12 inches, and I'm going to include a residual to catch some of that with those weeds that come up between 10 and 20-inch corn. So, some of the ones I already talked about, the post-residual premixes, you can be applied to corn bigger than about 12 inches tall. Maverick, right? The Acuron GT and Halix GT, which are mesotrione plus metolachlor plus glyphosate with bicyclopyrin and the Acuron GT, and then Resicor, you can also do this as well. Keeping in mind that for the Maverick and Resicor, if you have emerged grasses, you're going to need something else in there to control those emerged grasses. Right? And that same goes for a lot of these other products as well, but not all of them. So then you have other post-residual premixes that can be applied to corn bigger than about 12 inches. Anthem Flex Max, which is in some cases you're really going after for the peroxysulfone. You got pretty limited activity on weeds with the AIM and the Cadet that's in that. Armazon Pro, which is a mix of dimethenamide and the Pramazone or Armazon Caprino, which has Lautis and also thine-carbazone in it, and then some other products. So you've got the same type of thing here where you've got something in there for knockdown, and then you've got something with some residual. And in most of these cases, or a lot of these, it's a Site 15 herbicide. I see for the Impact Z here with the atrazine that I listed on the slide, that would not go on corn bigger than about 12 inches. And some other ones that fit into this same category. So if you have a lot of these that you can use, and if you go to some of the other slides I just talked about, some of these have glyphosate, so you'd obviously have to have Roundup Ready corn. Some other products that have been around for a couple of years, Elite 27, which is isoxaflutol or Balance Pro, without the safener, labeled for the GT27 beans, and it's only labeled for beans with that trait. It's not approved for use in every county, and I'll show you those here on the next slide. I still don't know why it's not approved for use in every county, and it controls broadleaf weeds and can suppress grasses. We've put it out with various other herbicides and by itself, and it actually looks relatively decent by itself for residual. We'd probably typically recommend some metribuzin or something with it. It does have activity on ALS-resistant common and giant ragweed, and also burr cucumber. And one of the problems with ALS-resistant ragweed is once you have that resistance, you have limited to no options for residual control. So it certainly fits in that category. You can also apply mesotrione on the GT27 bean as well, depending on, you have to find a mesotrione product that has that on its label, but it also can be used on the GT27 soybean. And it's labeled basically statewide, not just in certain counties. So here's the counties that it's labeled in. Without reading all of these, it's kind of an odd list. I haven't figured out really what the rationale is for it. So we just have a ton of soybean residual premixes right now. There's a couple new ones. Tendovo from Syngenta, which is chloranzylam or first rate with metribuzin with S-metolachlor. So you got 3 different sites in there, and then Preview. We had Authority MTZ up to this point from FMC, and UPI now has Preview, which is essentially the same thing with a different ratio, a mix of sulfentrazone with metribuzin, which is kind of a misses ragweeds really completely, common and giant ragweed, but is pretty strong on water hemp and Palmer amaranth. Just a reminder for any product containing sulfentrazone or flumioxazin, we have heard recurring concerns about crop injury from these, and they do cause injury. They're not the only products that do, but they're most injurious applied after planting in conventional till, and they're less injurious as crop residue increases and when applied a week or more before planting. And what the applying before planting allows us to get a rain on it and move it down into the soil somewhat. before you plant the beans, and so later rains that happen after planting don't splash that up and cause that type of injury. And that's a standard recommendation we make for all these products in the weed control guide. There's an environmental component here. There's also a variety component. Some varieties are more sensitive than others. So those are some steps you can take to try to minimize injury with those. And just a reminder about all these premixes, corn and soybeans, is we have a table in the back. We have various tables in the weed control guide. Table 22 allows you to look at some of those and figure out what's in there and look at and basically determine how much you have of various components so you can compare herbicides. So it basically lets you know what's there. Sometimes we don't list, it can be a little difficult to figure out what's going on. So in some cases you can go to the glossary in the back and look something up and see what the common names for the active herbicides in there. And where that comes in is in the weed control guide, both in the descriptions and also on the effectiveness table. Once we have enough products that have the same components, enough generics, we try to list some of those. We start listing it by common name instead of trade name. So in some cases, if for example here you're looking for Authority Assist, we're not going to list it by that in the header. You're going to have to figure out it has sulfentrazone and imazethapyr in it and then come back and look for it that way. Just some rundown on some of the current Enlist and Extend soybean guidelines. Enlist 1, Enlist Duo can go pre-plant, pre-emergence, and post. Enlist Duo is the glyphosate plus the 2,4-D choline. If you're less than 7 days before planting, you have to use one of these, or if you're after planting or post. If you're more than 7 days ahead of planting, the standard 2,4-D product label applies for this as well as other beans. You can go through R1 with the post-emergence, which is better than the previous wording which up to something. So through R1 means through flowering. From a runoff perspective, they're trying to get everyone to apply 48 hours before predicted rain, especially if that rain would cause runoff, as much as is practicable, and that really is hard to work with. I think spray volume of 10 to 15 gallons, 20 gallons though if you're mixing with glufosinate, since glufosinate a contact product, needs more activity, more smaller droplets. And there's a list of runoff mitigation measures you have to follow. I'll talk about those here on the next couple of slides. And then like a lot of new products, you have to check the website for info on approved tank mixes, nozzles, adjuvants, and things like that. Essentially, anything you put in the mix has to be on that approved list. So they divide soils into a couple different groups depending on soil texture. And you have to have a minimum of 4 or 6 credits off of this list, which seems a bit daunting, but a lot of times we're doing these anyway. You may already be doing a cover crop and have a field border, and have a grassed waterway and things like that. I'm not sure there's any personnel that really are going to be coming around checking this. I think the only way it would get checked is if you had regulatory people there looking at something else and they just happened to do it. So just keep in mind you're supposed to be doing enough of these practices to meet those 4 or 6 credits and try to reduce runoff. Some of the current Extend and Extend Flex soybean guidelines, because there's still a whole bunch that I'm not listing here, you have to take the training still every year on this. So for these 3 dicamba products that are labeled for Extend and Extend Flex beans, XtendiMax, Ingenia, Tavium, they have to be applied before June 30th. In the state of Ohio. XtendiMax is also up to the R1 stage. So if R1 stage occurs before June 30th, you have to stop then. And then Tavium up to the V4 stage, same type of thing. XtendiMax, you need to add a Vapor Grip extra agent or something similar to try to help reduce volatility. And then Ingenia, to accomplish the same thing, they're having you add a pH buffering adjuvant. When between 3 and 10 miles per hour, same type of thing, apply 48 hours before a forecasted runoff causing rain. 15 gallons or higher, no faster than 15 miles per hour, no AMS, and you have to, if you're concerned about hard water problems mixing with glyphosate, you have to use an approved AMS substitute off the website, and there's a separate website for each one of these products. The traits that we have, the Extend Flex, Enlist, Liberty, they're all pretty effective on some of the typical hard weeds we're dealing with. And we're still, the major weeds we deal with are just because they have difficult biologies and also herbicide resistance, or mare's-tailed giant ragweed, common ragweed, and water hemp and palmer, which I sort of lump into the same category. Non-GMO, you it's going to be almost impossible to control these, especially if you're going to be in a continuous non-GMO situation, or every other year you're likely to have ALS resistance already. And then once you get PPO resistance, site 14 in common ragweed or water hemp, you're not going to be able to control those weeds in non-GMO. And really, the same thing goes for Roundup Ready, because those weeds typically develop glyphosate resistance as well. But, given the right combination of applications and herbicides, and if you lack some of that herbicide resistance, you can maybe make those work. You can see we give everything else an excellent to good. This assumes you're using the appropriate system of herbicides, not that this is not a rating of Liberty, for example, or dicamba or 2,4-D. This is a rating of how effective a program in those beans would be if you're using the right combination of applications. And so essentially rate them all excellent. And for water hemp and palmer, we give an excellent to XtendFlex and Enlist because you have the ability to spray a couple different herbicides at work. Whereas Extend and Liberty Link, you're spraying either glufosinate or dicamba, so you're a little bit more restricted. Our current herbicide resistance, we have ALS resistance in all these. So that's Pursuit, Classic, any type of products like that, also in the residuals. We have glyphosate resistance in all those. It doesn't mean every population is, but most of them are a good portion. We have PPO or Site 14 resistance. That's Flexstar, Cobra, Valor, and Authority. In common ragweed, we have it in water hemp. And then in water hemp, some of our screening, we've determined we probably have at least variable response or some resistance to HPPD and Site 27, which is mesotrophin and other herbicides, some of the acetamides, dual peroxysulfone. And we've picked up certainly some variable response to 2,4-D. We've submitted populations to a regional project screening for glufosinate and dicamba as well. They haven't really found much in our populations, but there are populations in the country that have developed resistance in water hemp. So just to give you an example, here's a couple of different populations from Darke County, and you can see we're screening with atrazine, mesotrione, which is Callisto, 2,4-D, Fumesivin, which is Flexstar, and then metolachlor, which is dual in those products. And you can see population 2 was well controlled by a couple of different rates, 1x and 4x, and population 7 wasn't controlled at the 1x rate, the use rate, by any of these, which is indicative of at least low level resistance, if nothing else. And we struggled even at the 4x rate to get satisfactory control, with the exception of mesotrione and 2,4-D. So, the bottom line on these is this type of resistance is developing, and it's erratic. You may have resistance to 5 or 6 herbicides that could develop. You may have resistance to just a couple of these, but it's something to be aware of. Just a photo of what the metolachlor response of population 2 versus population 7 is. Population 7 grew more vigorously, but you can definitely see we got complete control of the population 2 at 1 and 4x and didn't of population 7. And that's why when we look at components of effective herbicide programs, all these weeds, because they have long periods of emergence and rapid growth and various things, and then also herbicide resistance, require a complex herbicide program involving different herbicide sites of action and also different applications. For example, Maris-tail germinates, essentially all year, so a fall burn down is helpful to keep the spring burn down more reasonable. It still needs a spring burn down application. It's going to need a spring residual ideally, and then you're going to have a post complement. If you do all that, you typically don't need a second post-emergence application, and there's no need for post-residual. Giant ragweed fall burn down is not helpful. It's also not helpful for common ragweed or water hemp. You're always going to have a spring burn down for giant ragweed, possibly for common and not usually for water hemp. And then you need a spring residual for essentially everything. We really don't recommend trying to control any of these weeds or other weeds as well without using residuals at the time of planting. They're all going to require a post-emergence complement. Giant ragweed, certainly depending on how early you spray and how good the control is from your first post, you can easily need a second post-emergence application, and 2 post applications is really the best way to drive down populations and reduce seed production in the end. The post plus residual fits well into water hemp, and I'll talk about that on the next couple of slides, and then you can, in some cases, need a second post-emergence for that as well. The difference in water hemp, palmer, and the other weeds is that you can add residual herbicides, the Site 15 herbicides, to a post-emergence application and get control, assuming you get rain and get that move down into the soil where the water hemp and palm are germinating, that can extend your control later into season, which really can be a benefit. They're most effective for this. Are pyroxasulfone is almost always the most effective of all these products, either pre or post emergence, followed by metolachlor, which gets more variable. If you have a premix of metolachlor or acetochlor plus wamesifin, which also has residual activity, that can be really effective. We generally, in this situation, the post-emergence rate acetochlor and dimethenamide is not as effective. The concept of this layered or overlapping residual is that you applied herbicides at planting, which is the yellow bar there, and then about the time that you start to lose that and reduce your activity on water hemp, you come back with an overlapping or a second layered application of residual. That's the Site 15 herbicides I talked about, which you can see extends your activity out. And if you're looking at an effective concentration, that red bar going across there for control of water hemp, you can see it because you come back and essentially recharge that and add more herbicide 30 days later. It extends that out into July. And we can get a lot of water hemp emerging in late June into early July, especially the ones that emerge before the soybeans canopy and get a little bit of height to them can be a real issue. And so this is the concept of this overlapping or layered residual. And these are both graphics from the University of Minnesota. This one showing when they came back 30 days after planting with the layered residual or the overlapping. That blue bar, they kept it at 94% control through about 70 days after planting versus just the one application, the red bar, which dropped off considerably. You're making a post-emergence application in there somewhere as well, but what it shows is that the layered really helps even control those ones that are emerging after you put a post application on. There's a couple different strategies here for water hemp. One is not to use post-residual, and we're certainly, I talked about Site 15 resistance or possible resistance in Ohio water hemp populations, and so, one response you might have is, okay, well, I don't really want to overuse those because I know I have some possible issues with developing resistance, which is a fair response. You can go with no post-residual if maybe it's a preventative mode or you've got low to moderate water hemp populations that you're handling pretty well and you're not having a lot of escapes and seed production at the end of the season. Your goal in this case, I think, is to extend time until the post is needed. So you're trying to shove the post out all the way until almost before canopy closure, if you can do that. You always want to hit water hemp with post herbicides before it's about 4 inches tall for your best control. So you want to maximize your residual at planting because you're not going to use more. And we would recommend a mixture or a premix of 3 herbicides with water hemp activity. Metribuzin, one of these, plus flumioxazin or sulfentrazone, plus a Site 15 herbicide. You may get away with just 2 of those, but really ideally you'd want to have all 3 if you're just trying to minimize the number of plants you're spraying with post herbicides and extending the time until you do it. And then apply the post herbicides when the water hemp are about 4 inches tall, or if you've just done such a good job with the residuals of holding them and they're very few or they're small, do it just prior to canopy closure. Second strategy is to go ahead with a layered or overlapping residual. Your goal here is to apply a post plus residual soon enough for activity on water hemp that emerge in June into early July. So doing this at canopy closure really doesn't work because a lot of the herbicide won't hit the ground and you've probably already got plants coming up. So you would probably in this case reduce the cost of your pre-emergence program. So instead of using a premix of 3 herbicides, you might just use 2 with metribuzin with flumioxazin or sulfentrazone, metribuzin with a Site 15 herbicide or a Site 15 herbicide with flumioxazin or sulfentrazone. And then apply the overlapping residual component, the Site 15 residual, with your post herbicides at 30 to 40 days after planting. The key here really is even if the water hemp are not evident, that's when you really want that second dose of residual to go on. The problem is you may not need your post herbicides at that point, although I would argue if you have any giant ragweed and grass, you probably would. But you can certainly apply the Site 15 into a seed bed that doesn't have any weeds in it at 30 to 40 days after planting, and then, omit the post and come back with a post, later as you need it prior to canopy closure. But again, the mistake here is waiting until crop canopy closure to apply the residual because it just really doesn't do what it's needed to and doesn't fit into the concept. Just a pitch for fall herbicide treatments, which are, we recommend making a fall herbicide treatment every other year to help out with some of the tough weeds that really need a fall treatment. Wild carrot, dock, dandelion, thistle, chickweed, mare's tail, and a lot of those. And if you think about the wet springs we've had, it also has a nice fit in terms of keeping a seedbed clean into the spring. So if you're delayed and it's wet and you can't get in, you don't have a big mess on your hands.